Several years ago, I was able to get this edger for almost nothing, and after checking it over, I called it good and then it disappeared in the bowels of my warehouse until today. Now the problem is, it's finally time to say goodbye to it, but after looking at it, time hasn't been so good to it. And before it goes away to its new home, we need to fix a couple of items that I didn't take care of years ago. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Troy-Bilt 4-cycle edger. And the problem is that I'm getting ready to put it up for sale, but first I need to fix parts of the fuel system. That way it'll ensure it's going to keep working for a long time from now or until they start putting the wrong fuel in it, which will then wreck the entire fuel system, but that'll be on them and not me. Now I'm going to try and repair this edger, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it and I'll be glad to answer your questions. So as with most edgers, even if they're a decade old, they may not have been used all that much, which is the case with this one too. So when I got it years ago, it was in really good shape, but time has not been good to it while in storage and has changed things, and not in a good way either. And unfortunately, there may be more wrong with it than the fuel lines and the purge bulb. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a bit when we try and start it. Now, since it was in long-term storage, I need to check and make sure there's oil in it. And that's because, depending upon the location it was at, sometimes they require the machines to not have any fluids in them. The reason is related to insurance and liabilities related to fire and safety concerns. And besides that, it's always a good thing to check the oil on a machine that you haven't seen in a long time, no matter if it's yours or not. It also looks like we have to take care of the wheels, since it appears I didn't lubricate them the last time. So I did put a small amount of fresh 100% gasoline into the fuel tank, which means we can try and start it. Now we only wanted to make sure that it started and ran. This was not meant to be a test on how well it works. So if you did see the older videos, you'll know that it ran just fine. However, I'm not happy with how many pulls it took to start this engine. And for those that didn't see the older videos, I'll let you know that I ended up servicing the carb with a new diaphragm along with checking and adjusting the valve clearances. And in those videos from years ago, it started a whole lot easier, so I am a bit concerned because it shouldn't be like this. Now the edger wasn't that dirty to begin with, so a rinse with a sprayer and a bit of air made it look even better. Like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be replacing the discolored purge bulb with a new one, and that's because as they become less transparent, they seem to be more likely to break. Now the only problem is that these bulbs come in different sizes, so make sure you get the right one you need. And if you don't know which one you need, I'd recommend getting a variety pack that'll come with 3 different ones, and one of them should work for you. I'm also going to be replacing the fuel lines, and that's because the lines that are on there now don't take ethanol fuel very well. And just like the purge bulb, make sure you get the right size because these come in varying sizes, and for this one, we'll be using the standard 3/16 of an inch. So as you just saw, the larger purge bulb is able to slip over the old one, which is not what you want it to do. That means it's much too big and will never fit on the carb like it's supposed to. Now the smaller one, however, just barely fits over the top part of the bulb, which means it is the right size, and that's the one we'll be using for this carb. Now I'm not going to take the carb off to replace the bulb, and that's because if you're really careful, you can do it while it's still connected to the engine. I do have to let you know that if you're not careful, things can go terribly wrong and the carb will not work like it's supposed to. So if you don't think you'll be able to do it this way, then I would recommend taking the carb off instead. And of course, you don't need to use a power tool either, but it does make it a whole lot easier and quicker as well. Now, after you install the new bulb, try using it and make sure that it still works, and if it doesn't, I'd recommend taking it back off and then trying it again. This one seems to be working, but there's no better way to find out than to try and start the edger again. So the good news is that it still starts and runs, but the bad news is that it's still tough to start. I'll have to consider my options later on about what to do about it, but for right now, we'll move on to replacing the fuel lines. I'm not sure if you know this, but these are the original fuel lines that came on the machine over a decade ago. And for some reason, these do not hold up very well over time, especially the green line, which is the fuel return line. Sometimes it won't just break, instead it'll split down the middle, which is less noticeable and could cause a fire hazard from leaking fuel from the tank. Now the other fuel line is of course the fuel filter line, and it's just as important as the return line, but for some reason the factory made it a different color. Now the best answer as to why this is would be that it made it easier to tell which one was which during the manufacturing process, but your guess is as good as mine. Now, I only use ethanol-free gasoline that's also been stabilized just on the off chance that I leave fuel in the machines for a little too long. So these fuel lines are in fair condition, but they could have been exposed to ethanol fuels before I ever got them. That means they may be on their way to breaking down just on a slower path, but if the new owner goes back to using ethanol fuel, it'll go downhill pretty quickly. So if you want to do yourself a huge favor, try not to use ethanol gasoline in your machines, and if you can't get ethanol-free fuel, your only choice is to use some sort of fuel stabilizer. However, I can't make any recommendations and I'll leave that up to you. Now I know it's tempting to try and make these openings in the fuel tank larger to make it easier to install the fuel lines, but instead I'd recommend cutting the lines at an angle and then using some sort of bent pliers to help pull them into the tank. Now the first fuel line that was installed was the return line, and when doing this I like to leave at least an inch of fuel line inside the tank. This will help to keep it from coming out of the fuel tank, and you're welcome to make it longer if you want to. After that, I'll cut the fuel line to length while giving it just a little bit of slack to work with. I'm also installing it on the straight brass port on the carb, which is the return port. Just make sure you're installing yours on the correct port as well. We'll then be using the same method for the fuel filter line, except this time we'll be making the line inside the fuel tank much longer. Now the reason is pretty obvious. We need the line to come out of the fuel tank so we can cut off that angle piece, that way we can install the fuel filter. Now if you've never done this kind of work before, just take your time and you might just have to do it more than once, so don't be surprised if you do. So there are several different types of fuel filters out there, some with weights in them and some without. And since this edger is going to be used mostly on flat ground, we won't have to worry about that, so I'll be installing this large filter instead of reusing the old one. Once the filter line has been installed in the tank, all we have to do next is cut the line to length, install it on the curved port on the carb, and then test it out. So when pressing on the purge bulb, fuel will come up the filter line and into the carb, fill the bulb, and then leave the carb and then return back to the tank. So as you can see, the fuel is moving through the lines just like it's supposed to. But if yours isn't flowing through the lines like this, then you might have to reseat the purge bulb again. So the next thing I'm going to do is add more gasoline to the fuel tank, that way I can do more testing to it after I get done filming. So here's the deal. If the purge bulb was working before you replaced it and it's not working afterwards, then check your work. But if the machine is new to you and it didn't work before you replaced it and it still didn't work afterwards, then I would be looking at the carb as the problem. So the next step is to work on the wheels, and even though this isn't a lawnmower and isn't going to see miles of edging, I'd still like to give them the best chance to last as long as possible, and to do that we'll need to take the wheels off the edger. I'm going to be spraying some lithium grease on the axles, but you're welcome to use whatever you have on hand. But of course, there are good choices and even better choices for lubricants, so keep that in mind, but to be honest, something is better than nothing at all. So just spraying a silicone-based spray lube on the front and the back of the wheels around the axle would be better than nothing at all. And if you decide to not do anything because you don't think it's needed, then I can respect your choice. So while we're here, we might as well check and make sure that the height adjuster arm is working as well, and if it's not, then spraying some lube on the pivot should make it work even better. Now this one is working, but it's not as easy as it should be, so I'll apply some around the bolt and then work the lever again. Unfortunately, the other two wheels are a different story, and they'll need to be removed along with the bolt to be able to lubricate them. Now these wheels are admittedly pretty cheap and don't have any inserts in them that would benefit from this kind of attention. That means they built these to a cost, trying to make as much money as possible, and you can't blame them. Don't worry, you're going to know when a machine you're working on is a better machine than this, and the wheels will be a pretty good giveaway every time. However, applying some kind of lubricant to them will keep them from wearing out at the axle, so doing this once in a while is worth it. So I know this edger isn't worth all that much on the used market, but if you wanted to buy a new replacement for this one of the same type, just get ready to be surprised by the prices you're going to see at the store. Now they do have even cheaper ones on the market, but there's a good chance that you've never heard the brand name before. The very last thing to do is to lubricate the cables, purge the system of any air, and then try starting it again. Hopefully it starts better, and if it doesn't, we may have to go even further with the maintenance. Well, it's still tough to start, but the good part is that it does start and runs pretty well too. So if you are curious, I have been following these starting instructions, which might work well for a machine when it's new, but now that it's over a decade old, we might have to make adjustments to the starting procedure to compensate for any issues it's developed in the last 10 years. The reason it could be starting so poorly might not be related to the carb, but to the engine, which might be expensive to fix. And if you were to take it to a repair shop to get their opinion, well, I think you know what they'd recommend. Look, at least this one still works, and I'm sure it'll make someone a really good machine so they don't have to use one of those bigger edgers. So my question is, would you recommend that I spend more time on it to try and make it easier to start, or leave it the way that it is and just inform the buyer about it and let them decide if they want to live with it? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.